Alright, hello and welcome. Been a while since we've done a rework video, but Atlas deserves one, so here we are. So, before we talk about any changes I'd like to make to his abilities, let's go over what his abilities are and kind of the positives and negatives that they all have. With that, we have some level 150 enemies out here that we are going to be guinea pigging, and we're going to start from his fourth ability, which are his Rumblers. This is a really cool ability, because you're summoning golems. Like, come on. What more do you really want, right? Well, ideally you would want an ability that feels like it's doing much. Even with as much power strength as this build has, which is quite a bit, these guys don't really do very much damage, even to fodder enemies, and they don't really draw a whole lot of aggro that is going to save you in any real situation as Atlas. So they're a bit on the unfortunate side, besides just how fucking cool they are. So, ideally, this power would remain about the same, but just be really good instead of kinda underwhelming, especially for a fourth ability. Moving on, we've got Atlas's 3. Atlas's 3 is basically Chroma's 1, except for it can stun enemies and lock them in place, which means this ability's terrible. Even on fodder enemies, like wasting time going into this where I can only walk and can't jump, and also can't use any of my other abilities, it's a pretty rough proposition, even on fodder enemies, to be using this thing. So, that ability mostly suffers from just not being very good, and it honestly really doesn't feel very good to use either. Though, the effect of, like, petrifying someone, it fits thematically, and that effect is pretty useful, and should probably be incorporated into his kit one way or another. Moving on, we've got his 2, which is Tectonics. You summon a Bulwark, which is basically just a rock wall. Enemies cannot pass through this, whereas you can, and this is occasionally useful in places where you need to route enemies or bug out enemy AI more accurately, make it so they can't go certain places. Namely, this is useful in the Index with its Augment to make it so enemies can't score. Besides that, you can roll it, which is highly ineffectual. It does some damage, and it can drag enemies along with it, but in general, it's just really not very good. It doesn't really do very much damage, and it's just, as an offensive ability, it is highly underwhelming, and as a defensive ability, this shield really isn't very big, and you can't shoot through it, so it's like a much, much worse Volt shield. So this ability definitely needs to be pumped up a little bit, just because it's cool, like his 4, but just not very good. And then finally, we have Atlas's standout power, his 1. This is by far his best ability. It scales with melee mods, and it does really good damage and has some crowd control in it, plus you are invulnerable while dashing. So that is his Landslide. This is a very good ability, and it does damage even to level 150 enemies at like a pretty decent rate, along with knocking them around, which, honestly, hard to complain about. This ability is very solid, and we're not going to be changing this very much, because this is Atlas's current bread and butter, and, like, drastically changing that would be an abject mistake. And then finally, he has his passive, which is whenever he is standing on the ground, he's immune to CC, though I believe that does not include stumbles like from Grenier Rollers, which is a bit unfortunate. So that's what he's got for right now. It's a decent start, but it needs to be a lot better. So let's look at his abilities and talk about what should change. We'll go forward this time. Passive, no change is needed. It's a great passive, one of the better passives in the game, period. Landslide, this ability is really good, and the only thing I could even suggest changing would be that adding power range would also increase the dash distance. Right now, the dash distance of Landslide is locked to 15 meters, and that can't be increased with range. If it could be increased with range, that would be really nice for the ability, though definitely not needed. Moving on, we've got Tectonics. Tectonics lacks offensive stuff. It shouldn't have, like, it doesn't need, like, tons of defensive capabilities. It doesn't need to be, like, way larger or anything like that. But it doesn't work into what you kind of want to always be doing as Atlas, which is always be punching. So, with that, I would like to change Tectonics to have direct synergy with Landslide, in that you would pop Tectonics and then be able to use Landslide on Tectonics to destroy it, and turn it into a large, like whatever way you happen to be facing, rock shotgun, essentially, taking in the health and the damage from this ability and combining that with your punch to shoot it out in like a cone of damage. This would be a very effective way to work Tectonics into like what you're generally doing with damage. Run into a hallway, see a bunch of dudes, pop Tectonics, and then you have an option to landslide it to push all that damage into those enemies to eliminate them. That gives you a little bit more distance than landslide may like often offer, and where you don't want to go into a big crowd of enemies with landslide. And it offers a way to increase the damage of landslide in a more interesting way. I think that would be a fantastic way to bring Tectonics into a thing that you're deciding to use very often, as opposed to only having a few very niche uses. This would also make the augment for Tectonics significantly better, as you could set up multiple rock walls to have multiple shots, essentially, when combining that with landslide, which I think would be very interesting. Next, we're going to skip Petrify, as Petrify needs some more drastic changes that will kind of work into the other changes that I would like to make to Rumblers, and also the changes that we just talked about with Tectonics. Rumblers, as it stands right now, are really cool, but what if they could offer Atlas a defensive capability? Right now, the only thing that's defensive about Atlas, unfortunately, is that he can't die while he's landsliding. And as fun and good as landslide is, there are a lot of situations in Warframe where you just don't want to be locked into an ability, especially if that ability in some cases can't do damage to certain enemies. So, for Rumblers, combining your one with a Rumbler would allow you to wear your Rumbler like armor, gaining their health, gaining their armor, and adding a little bit of damage to your one, giving you a very good reason to have like a nice like big Rumbler, more reason to have more duration, and all that business. Basically, it would function like Iron Skin, but have the visual appearance that it does in Conclave. For those of you that are not aware, there is an augment for Atlas in Conclave where he is already wearing his Rumbler. That's already a thing that exists for Atlas. So that would also save a lot of work on DE's part for not having to add like a model of him with his Rumbler on, as that already exists. With that, there is kind of the much larger change to Petrify. Making it so that Atlas isn't doing Petrify would definitely be the ideal. At base, this has about a 14-meter range. So, instead of Atlas doing it, cut that range in half to 7 meters and have him be able to make little stone obelisks, not unlike the ones that you would see in Zelda. With that, those would basically be able to be built and put down, and then it's just doing that ability for a set amount of time, say 25 seconds base, in front of it, and you can place maximum, say, 2. That means that you can have those placed kind of wherever you want, strategic locations, cool stuff like that, and also have Petrify be able to heal Tectonics and also heal the Rumblers and the Rumbler while you're wearing it. This would give a lot of synergy to his entire kit and give him a lot more reason to always be using all of his powers, and also an out into not just being pigeonholed into only ever using Landslide, giving him a good reason to just always be doing everything, really, much like, say, Nidus. I think that would be a really good way to bring his kit together and give him a lot to do always, while not like ruining the core of what Atlas is right now and what I think a lot of people find really fun, which is Landslide. Instead, building on that where all his powers complement Landslide, really. So, it may not be very complicated, right? And I don't think superbly flashy, although I think it would be a hell of a lot of fun to watch. But that is what I think should happen with Atlas. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I will see you tomorrow.